The years 1837 to 38 are identified as a period of apostasy in the church. For a variety of reasons, some members allow themselves to lose the light of the gospel and fall by the wayside. Some of the saints fell away from the truths they had once gladly received. Speaking of this difficult time, the prophet said,
"The enemy abroad and apostates in our midst united their schemes and became disaffected toward me as though I were the sole cause of those very evils I was most strenuously striving against, which were actually brought upon us by the brethren not giving heed to my counsel."
In spite of the troubles of Kirtland, the prophet and Sidney Rigdon undertook a journey to Missouri. Their primary mission was to aid in establishing places of gathering for the saints. Joseph's party arrived in Terre Haute, Indiana on October 12, 1837. Unknown to Joseph, one of the great ladies of Mormonism lay dying at that moment. The prophet later recorded,
"My brother Hiram's wife, Jerusha Barden Smith, died on the 13th of October while I was at Terre Haute and her husband at Far West. She left 5 small children and numerous relatives to mourn her loss. Her demise was severely felt by all. She said to one of her tender offspring when on her dying bed, 'Tell your father when he comes that the Lord has taken your mother home and left you for him to take care of.'"
While Joseph was in Missouri, a number of apostates in Kirtland banded together in an effort to overthrow the church. Among those conspiring to do so were Warren Parrish, John F. Boynton, Luke S. Johnson, and Joseph Coe. Soon after the prophet's return, these dissenters publicly renounced Joseph and the doctrines which he represented. They attempted to set up their own church and openly attacked those who still supported the prophet. Heber C. Kimball said of this situation,
"I have seen the day when it was as much as our lives were worth to sustain Joseph Smith. The apostates were so thick around us, and persecution was so great."
These apostates even claimed that the Kirtland temple belonged to them. One Sabbath morning, Warren Parrish and a number of his party came into the temple and seated themselves in the Aaronic priesthood pulpits on the east end of the first floor. They were armed with pistols and bowie knives. Father Smith and other brethren occupied the Melchizedek priesthood pulpits on the opposite or west side of the building. Sister Eliza R. Snow has narrated the scene that followed.
Soon after the usual opening services, one of the brethren on the west stand arose, and just after he commenced to speak, one on the east interrupted him. Father Smith, presiding, called to order. He told the apostate brother that he should have all the time he wanted, but he must wait his turn. As the brother on the west took the floor and commenced first to speak, he must not be interrupted. A fearful scene ensued, the apostate speaker becoming so clamorous that Father Smith called for the police to take that man out of the house, when Parrish, John Boynton, and others drew their pistols and bowie knives and rushed down from the stand into the congregation. J. Boynton saying that he would blow out the brains of the first man who dared to lay hands on him. Many in the congregation, especially women and children, were terribly frightened. Some tried to escape from the confusion by jumping out of the windows. Amid screams and shrieks, the policeman, in ejecting the belligerents, knocked down a stovepipe which fell helter-skelter among the people. But although bowie knives and pistols were wrested from their owners and thrown hither and thither to prevent disastrous results, no one was hurt. And after a short but terrible scene to be enacted in a temple of God, order was restored and the services of the day proceeded as usual.
The temple became a focal point for discussion on the state of affairs. At a council meeting held in one of the upper rooms, a member of the opposition advanced the question of how they could drop Joseph Smith and sustain David Whitmer in his place. Brigham Young was present and immediately came to the prophet's defense.
"I rose up and told them in a plain and forcible manner that Joseph was a prophet, and I knew it, and that they might rail at and slander him as much as they pleased. They could not destroy the appointment of the prophet of God. They could only destroy their own authority, cut the thread which bound them to the prophet and to God, and sink themselves to hell. During this siege of darkness, I stood close by Joseph, and with all the wisdom and power God bestowed upon me, put forth my utmost energies to sustain the servant of God and unite the quorums of the church."
Brigham Young proved to be such an able defender of the prophet that the apostate sought to still his voice by taking his life. In order to save himself, it was necessary to flee Kirtland for Missouri. On the morning of December 22, 1837, he made his escape. Elder Young reported,
"I left Kirtland in consequence of the fury of the mob and the spirit that prevailed in the apostates, who threatened to destroy me because I would proclaim publicly and privately that I knew by the power of the Holy Ghost that Joseph Smith was a prophet of the Most High God and had not transgressed and fallen, as apostates declared."
Apostasy, persecution, and mobocracy forced the prophet and Sidney Rigdon to leave Kirtland on the evening of January 12, 1838. Zerah Pulsifer said,
Joseph was carried away in a box nailed in an ox sled to save his life.
The prophet and Sidney then continued their flight on horseback. They traveled throughout the night and arrived the next morning among the saints in Norton Township, Medina County, Ohio, some 60 miles from Kirtland. Here they were joined by their families and continued their journey toward Far West. While yet 120 miles from Far West, Joseph and his party were met by brethren who had come out to greet them. Alerted to his coming, they brought teams and the necessary monies to see them safely to their destination. As they entered Far West on March 14, 1838, the prophet recorded,
Many of the brethren came out to meet us, who also with open arms welcomed us to their bosoms. We were immediately received under the hospitable roof of Brother George W. Harris, who treated us with all possible kindness.
Through the watchful eye of the Lord and the aid of true friends, Joseph had again escaped the vengeance of his enemies. The safe arrival of Joseph Smith and his presence in the community of Far West was a welcome event for the saints in March 1838. The following month, on April 26, 1838, the prophet received a revelation designating the official name of the church. Up until this time, the organization had been referred to by a series of names: the Church of Christ, the Church of Jesus Christ, the Church of God, and the Church of the Latter-day Saints. However, on this date, the Lord specifically identified the correct title when he stipulated,
For thus shall my church be called in the last days, even the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
In May, the prophet left Far West and took a company of men into the country lying northward. Their mission was to explore and lay claim to lands which were suitable for the gathering of the saints. They traveled approximately 25 miles from Far West to the site of Brother Lyman White's home near the Grand River in Daviess County. In describing this move, the prophet has given us some unusual insight regarding Father Adam, the common ancestor of all mankind.
We pursued our course up the river, mostly through timber, for about 18 miles, when we arrived at Colonel Lyman White's home. He lives at the foot of Tower Hill, a name I gave the place in consequence of the remains of an old Nephite altar or tower that stood there, where we camped for the Sabbath. In the afternoon, I went up the river about half a mile to White's Ferry, accompanied by President Rigdon and my clerk, George W. Robinson, for the purpose of selecting and laying claim to a city plat near said ferry in Daviess County, which the brethren called Spring Hill. But by the mouth of the Lord it was named Adam-on-Diamond, because, said he, it is the place where Adam shall come to visit his people, or the Ancient of Days shall sit, as spoken of by Daniel the prophet.
The term Adam-on-Diamond was not new to the prophet. He had received revelation on the subject in 1832 and 1835. In the latter communication, the Lord told Joseph about a gathering of Adam and his righteous posterity in a place by that name, just prior to the patriarch's death. The Lord stated,
3 years previous to the death of Adam, he called Seth, Enos, Canaan, Mahalaleel, Jared, Enoch, and Methuselah, who were all high priests, with the residue of his posterity, who were righteous, into the valley of Adam-on-Diamond, and there bestowed upon them his last blessing. And the Lord appeared unto them, and they rose up and blessed Adam, and called him Michael, the prince, the archangel. And the Lord administered comfort unto Adam, and said unto him, I have set thee to be at the head. A multitude of nations shall come of thee, and thou art a prince over them forever. And Adam stood up in the midst of the congregation, and notwithstanding he was bowed down with age, being full of the Holy Ghost, predicted whatsoever should befall his posterity unto the latest generation.
Now in 1838, the Lord had actually revealed the location of Adam-on-Diamond to Joseph and informed him of a still future event when Adam would again come to that place and visit his people. Of that occasion, Joseph Fielding Smith has written,
Not many years hence there shall be another gathering of high priests and righteous souls in this same valley of Adam-on-Diamond. At this gathering, Adam, the Ancient of Days, will again be present. At this time, the vision which Daniel saw will be enacted. The Ancient of Days will sit. There will stand before him those who have held the keys of all dispensations, who shall render up their stewardships to the first patriarch of the race, who holds the keys of salvation. This shall be a day of judgment and preparation.
In modern times, the church has acquired several hundred acres of ground, including a sizable portion of the key properties at Adam-on-Diamond. Presently, there is no LDS visitor center at the location to direct the inquirer, but appropriate signs do mark the site of a Nephite altar. This location may also be the site of an Adamic prayer altar on Tower Hill and the laid rock foundation of Lyman White's home a little further down that same hill. Because of certain debts owed by the church and the continuing expense of operation, Joseph was greatly concerned about the poor financial condition of the institution. The prophet took his economic difficulties to the Lord and asked him how much the property owned by the saints in Missouri should be called upon by the church for a tithing. His prayers were answered. By the word of revelation, through his servant, the prophet, the Lord instructed the saints, saying,
I require all their surplus property to be put into the hands of the bishop of my church in Zion, for the building of mine house, and for the laying of the foundation of Zion, and for the priesthood, and for the debts of the presidency of my church. And this shall be the beginning of the tithing of my people. And after that, those who have thus been tithed shall pay 1/10 of all their interest annually. And this shall be a standard law unto them forever, for my holy priesthood, saith the Lord.
The law of tithing established at that time continues to have a very decided effect upon all faithful members of the church today. Temples, chapels, hospitals, educational facilities, missions, and facets of the welfare program are among the worthy institutions supported by the Lord's 10th part. The Father has promised those who willingly give of their substance that he will
pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it.
While the Latter-day Saints in Missouri were peacefully attempting to establish their communities in Caldwell, Daviess, and Carroll counties, an event took place which was but a prelude to a much greater conflict and eventual exile from the whole state of Missouri. The first Monday in August had been appointed as Election Day in Gallatin, the county seat of Daviess County. A local citizen by the name of William P. Peniston was seeking election to the state legislature and knew that the Mormons would vote against him, as he had strongly opposed the saints in Daviess County and elsewhere. On Election Day, August 6, 1838, Peniston arrived at the poll, climbed up on a barrel, and began to excite the electors against the Mormons, saying,
Mormon leaders are a set of horse thieves, liars, counterfeiters, and you know they profess to heal the sick and cast out devils, and you know that is a lie.
Feelings became very excited on both sides following his fiery speech. Angry words were exchanged freely between the parties. It was apparently a drunken follower of Peniston named Richard Welding who started the actual fighting. He attacked a Mormon, Samuel Brown, and began to beat him very severely. Others joined in the scuffle, and the great knockdown was on. Most accounts indicate that the Mormons claimed victory in the affair and record that some of the saints took time to cast their ballots before returning to their homes. The far-reaching results of this Election Day battle had only begun, however. As word went out to the surrounding area, armed mob recruits began coming into Gallatin. The brethren returned to their homes, gathered their families, and hid them in the woods. The men then stood guard throughout the night while the women and children lay on the ground in the rain. A false report reached the prophet at Far West. He was informed that 2 or 3 of the brethren had been killed at Gallatin, the members prevented from voting, and that the citizens of Daviess were determined to drive the saints from the county. Joseph immediately responded by forming a company from among the brethren and riding to Adamondiamon just above Gallatin to learn what had actually taken place. He was happy to discover that no one had been killed, although several were badly wounded. The prophet responded,
Blessed be the memory of those few brethren who contended so strenuously for their constitutional rights and religious freedom against such an overwhelming force of desperados.
Word was received by the brethren in Far West that a mob planned to attack Adamondiamon, and a company was immediately dispatched to assist in the defense of that community. News also came that a carriage bearing a load of arms and ammunition was on its way from Richmond to Daviess County for the use of the mob in that sector. Judge Elias Higbee, the highest civil authority in Caldwell County, ordered Captain William Allred and a company of 10 mounted men to intercept the shipment of weapons. Brother John Tanner, a member of Allred's detachment, supplied the following account of that affair.
When all were mounted, the prophet Joseph said to Brother Allred, I want you to ride as fast as your horses can carry you, pointing the direction that he might not reach the road in rear of the carriage, and you will get those arms. These last words inspired faith in the little band, and even the horses did not seem to become weary. When we neared the road, we cast our eyes towards Richmond, and at a distance of about half a mile, we discovered a black covered carriage standing in the road, without any team attached to it. On nearing it, we saw that it was empty. We examined and found that one of the axles was newly broken in two. Here was the carriage described, but where were the guns? We soon discovered a trail in the high grass where something heavy had been dragged from near the carriage. We followed this trail a short distance and found a wooden box containing 74 United States Yagers. While consulting how to get them to the town, We looked in the direction of the mob and discovered two men coming about as fast as they could drive in a lumber wagon. When they discovered us, supposing us to be mobs, they swung their hats and shouted hooray 2 or 3 times, and our little troop responded in the same way. They got very near before they discovered their mistake. Brother Allred directed the teamster to drive alongside of the box. He then told the 2 men to get out and put it into the wagon, and then follow him. We returned the way we came and reached our destination about sundown.
There were actually 3 men involved: John B. Comer, William L. McConney, and Allen Miller, who were taken into custody for abetting and aiding the mob. They were brought before Albert Petty, Justice of the Peace, for examination. Lilburn W. Boggs, governor of the state of Missouri, had received a series of reports concerning the difficulties between the Latter-day Saints and the mob element. In the latter part of August 1838, he had issued orders to General David R. Atchison, commander of the 3rd Division, Missouri Militia, and several other generals, instructing them to put a specified number of their commands in readiness should they be needed to stop a disturbance. As the situation became increasingly difficult, General Atchison ordered General Alexander W. Donovan, commander of the 1st Brigade of the 3rd Division, to march his command to Daviess County to prevent war between the Mormon and non-Mormon forces. Donovan stopped at Far West and ordered that the prisoners taken in the recent arms shipment and the arms themselves be delivered into his hands. The prisoners were turned over immediately, but the guns had to be collected. General Donovan next proceeded to Daviess County. Going to the non-Mormon encampment, he found between 200 and 300 mobbers under the command of Dr. W. W. Austin of Carroll County. Donovan ordered them to disperse and go home, but they refused on the grounds that they had organized purely for defense. The general then visited the Mormon camp, where Lyman White assured him that they were willing to meet the requirements of the law, but that the hostile forces must also disband. To prevent bloodshed, Donovan camped on the direct road between the 2 contending factions. General Atchison arrived on the scene and ordered all the men from adjoining counties to go to their homes. Unable to move against the Saints in Daviess County because of the presence of state militia and a strong defensive unit of Mormons under Lyman White, Dr. W. W. Austin took his mobbers to Carroll County. There they joined with another mob force which was preparing for a showdown battle with the Mormons in DeWitt, a small farming community near the mouth of the Grand River. The Saints were warned to leave before October 1st or face extermination without regard to age or sex. A letter from the Saints to Governor Boggs explaining their desperate situation and calling upon him for relief and protection was never answered. Mobbers continued to come in from the surrounding counties to assist in the siege of the community. The Mormons also received reinforcements. During the week of September 28, 1838, John E. Page came into DeWitt with a company of Canadian Saints traveling in 30 wagons. The prophet was notified of the troubles in DeWitt and made plans to go there. He hoped to settle the feelings of the citizens and save the lives of the Saints. When he arrived about the 1st of October, Joseph had a great deal of difficulty getting into the community. The mob was guarding all the principal entrances, and he was obliged to slip in by way of little-traveled roads. He found that the Saints' provisions were almost exhausted, with small hope of obtaining any more. A messenger was dispatched immediately to Governor Boggs, informing him of the circumstances. But he informed the Saints that the quarrel was between the Mormons and the mob, and that they must fight it out. Such was the stage for the first real skirmish. Over a period of days, houses belonging to the Saints were burned, their cattle driven away, and a large amount of property destroyed by the mob. In order to settle the difficulty, General Parks and his command of state militia went to Carroll County to intervene. But his own troops were in sympathy with the mob, and he was helpless to carry out his orders. It became increasingly apparent that the Mormons could not maintain their hold on DeWitt. The non-Mormons pledged that if the Saints would depart, no one would be injured, and that they would be repaid for all their losses. The brethren determined that to avoid serious bloodshed, it would be best to depart. Commenting on their decision, the prophet recorded,
We had now no hopes whatever of successfully resisting the mob, who kept constantly increasing. Our provisions were exhausted, and we being wearied out by continually standing on guard and watching the movements of our enemies, who, during the time I was there, fired at us a great many times. Some of the brethren died for want of common necessaries of life, and perished from starvation. And for once in my life, I had the pain of beholding some of my fellow creatures fall victims to the spirit of persecution.
The Saints evacuated DeWitt in about 70 wagons on the afternoon of October 11, 1838. They carried with them the remnants of the property which they were able to save. The mob never kept its promise to restore their losses. An eyewitness of their departure reported,
There was something pitiful in the condition of the Mormons after the surrender. The majority of them were poor and had their all invested in the settlement of DeWitt. Winter was approaching, and they were forced from their little but comfortable homes into the inhospitable weather of a Missouri autumn and late fall, with their wives and children and all they possessed on earth. But they loaded up their property on the wagons, and the long process evacuated the place, the men with heads depressed, the women in tears, and all casting longing, lingering looks behind, as they left a place where they had hoped to live their lives out in peace, plenty, and quietude.
They traveled about 12 miles that day and camped in a grove of trees. During the evening, a Sister Jensen died. She had given birth to a child a short time before and had not sufficiently regained her strength. Her burial took place in the grove without a coffin. The prophet recalled that the mob continued to prey upon them even during the Exodus. He wrote,
During our journey, we were continually harassed and threatened by the mob, who shot at us several times, whilst several of our brethren died from the fatigue and privation which they had to endure, and we had to inter them by the wayside, without coffin, and under circumstances the most distressing. We arrived in Caldwell on the 12th of October.
The saints at DeWitt were not the only souls harassed by the mob element. Just before the prophet had gone to the assistance of the saints in DeWitt, a large company of members arrived at Far West from Ohio. They had left that state because of local persecution and were known as the Kirtland camp. This company, numbering approximately 529 souls at the time of starting, was organized under the leadership of the First Council of the 70. A massive move was decided upon because many of the saints lacked the individual means of making the journey, but by putting their resources together, they were enabled to make the trip. The trek commenced on July 6, 1838, with some 65 teams employed to pull the loaded vehicles. The Lord blessed them abundantly on their way, as evidenced in the following account.
On the road near Bellefontaine, Ohio, one of the sons of Martin H. Peck had a wagon wheel run over his leg. But as the Lord would have it, and to the astonishment of all, considering the weight of the load on the wagon, he received no particular injury, although the wheel ran over the boy's leg on a hard road without any obstruction whatever. The wheel made a deep cut in the limb, but after hands were laid on him in the name of the Lord, the boy was able to walk considerable in the course of the afternoon. This was one, but not the first, of the wonderful manifestations of God's power unto us on the journey.
As soon as the saints abandoned DeWitt, in their flight from Carroll County, the mob left that area and marched toward Adirondack once again. This lawless element was encouraged by the apparent lack of concern on the part of Governor Boggs and the inability of the state militia to keep the peace. The Mormons were determined to resist the mob force and organized themselves into military companies agreeable to orders received from General Alexander W. Doniphan. In Far West, the saints were called upon to defend their homes and families. The prophet preached a sermon on Sunday, October 14, 1838, based upon the words of the Savior. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. At the conclusion of his remarks, Joseph called for all those who would stand with him to meet on the public square the next morning. 200 men responded to this request. The prophet again addressed the saints assembled, as did Sidney Rigdon. At the end of the meeting, 100 men under the command of Colonel George M. Hinkle were sent to aid the saints at Adirondack. Hinkle was a Mormon who had been commissioned by the state of Missouri. On October 17th, word was received at Diamond, the popularized name for Adirondack in use at the time, that the mob was burning houses in nearby Millport. This fact was confirmed by the arrival of Agnes Smith, wife of Don Carlos Smith. She had been forced at gunpoint from her home and required to walk 3 miles in the snow and then wade the icy waters of the Grand River to make an escape. Agnes carried her 2 little children much of the way to Diamond. The prophet described the difficult circumstances which arose from the burning. He stated,
A number of houses belonging to our people were burned by the mob, who committed many other depredations, such as driving off horses, sheep, cattle, hogs, etc. A number whose houses were burned down, as well as those who lived in scattered and lonely situations, fled into the town for safety and for shelter from the inclemency of the weather, as a considerable snowstorm had taken place just about that time. Women and children, some in the most delicate situations, were thus obliged to leave their homes and travel several miles in order to effect their escape. My feelings were such as I cannot describe when I saw them flock into the village, almost entirely destitute of clothes and only escaping with their lives.
At this time, Captain Samuel Bogart, a devoted anti-Mormon, marched the troops in his command to the northern part of Ray County. He did so without orders from his superior officer, but contended that his move was necessary to secure Ray County from a Mormon invasion. Bogart then asked for and received permission from General David R. Atchison to patrol or range the line between Caldwell and Ray. For a militia officer who was reportedly attempting to keep the peace, his actions were just the opposite. Captain Bogart crossed into southern Caldwell County and began to threaten the saints in that sector. He and some of his men stopped at Brother Pinkham's, took his son and 2 other young men as their prisoners, shot at and hit one of his cows, took his arms, and told the old man that he must leave before morning, or they would kill him and his family. The three young men, Nathan Pinkham, William Seeley, and Addison Green, were taken to Bogart's encampment on Crooked River and held there. When it was learned in Far West that three brethren had been kidnapped, Judge Elias Higbee ordered a company of Mormon militia to march to the camp, disperse the mob, and retake the prisoners. 75 mounted men under the command of Captain David W. Patton were directed to the site of the enemy encampment. Parley P. Pratt participated in that ride and the ensuing battle. He has given this account of the action.
In this solemn procession, we moved on for some 2 hours, when it was supposed that we were in the neighborhood of danger. We were then ordered to dismount and leave our horses in care of part of the company, while the others should proceed on foot along the principal highway to see what discoveries could be made. This precaution was for fear we might be suddenly attacked, in which case we could do better on foot than on horseback. We had not proceeded far when, as we entered the wilderness, we were suddenly fired upon by an unknown enemy in ambush. First, one solitary gun, as was supposed from some outpost of the enemy, brought one of our number to the ground, where he lay groaning while the rest of the troop had to pass directly by his dying body. It was dawn of the day in the eastern horizon, but darkness still hovered over the awful scene. When our men saw that they were ambushed and attacked, they found it too late to retreat, and orders were issued to form along the brush and under the cover of trees, which was instantly done, while the enemy, though unseen, were pouring in a deadly fire upon our whole line. We soon returned the fire and charged upon the enemy. The whole wilderness seemed for a few moments as if wrapped in a blaze of lightning and overwhelmed with the sharp crack of peals of thunder. The enemy were soon driven from their ambush and completely routed. Having a creek immediately in their rear, many were seen forcing their retreat through the stream and up to their arms in water. The firing now ceased and the whole battleground resounded with the watchword, God and Liberty. Our forces, which had been thrown into some disorder, were instantly formed and their pieces reloaded, while here and there over the battleground lay the dead and wounded.
3 saints died in the fighting: David W. Patton, Patrick O'Banion, and Gideon Carter. Among Bogart's men, Moss Rowland was shot to death. During the engagement, 2 of the 3 Mormons who had been kidnapped were able to escape when the firing first commenced. But the third was shot as he attempted to run from his captors. However, his wound was attended to by the brethren, and he eventually recovered. Elder David W. Patton, one of the original 12 apostles in the new dispensation, had been shot in the abdomen as he led the charge to the riverbank. He was taken to the home of Brother Stephen Winchester, about 3 miles from Far West. Sister Phoebe Ann Patton, David's wife, hurried to his side, as did the prophet, Hiram, Heber C. Kemble, and others. Elder Kemble recorded the stricken man's last moments in these words:
The principles of the gospel, which were so precious to him before, afforded him that support and consolation at the time of his departure, which deprived death of its sting and horror. Speaking of those who had fallen from their steadfastness, he exclaimed, "Oh, that they were in my situation! For I feel that I have kept the faith. I have finished my course. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me." Speaking to his beloved wife, he said, "Whatever you do else, oh, do not deny the faith." He all the time expressed a great desire to depart. I said to him, "Brother David, when you get home, I want you to remember me." He replied, "I will." At this time his sight was gone. A few minutes before he died, he prayed as follows: "Father, I ask thee in the name of Jesus Christ, that thou wouldst release my spirit and receive it unto thyself." And he then said to those who surrounded his dying bed, "Brethren, you have held me by your faith, but do give me up, and let me go, I beseech you." We accordingly committed him to God, and he soon breathed his last and slept in Jesus without a groan.
Rumor on its many wings was scattered far and wide. It was reported that Captain Bogart and his entire force had been massacred by the Mormons, and that the saints intended to burn the communities of Buncombe and Richmond. Although without fact, the news frightened the non-Mormons in the area. Public meetings were called, and resolves carried out to alert the governor. Amos Reese and Wiley C. Williams, representatives of the people, left Richmond on the evening of October 24, 1838, for Jefferson City. They had in their possession a letter, received en route, from Judge E. M. Ryland, which called for the raising of volunteers to exterminate or expel them, the Mormons, from the state in mass. The report from these men, coupled with other appeals, caused Governor Boggs to take very decisive action. Without verifying the accuracy of the claims made against the Mormons, he issued his infamous extermination order. A portion of that document reads as follows.
The Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state.
Reaction to the governor's order was immediate. The gathering of militia to march against the Mormons only served to heighten the activity of the mobs against a popular foe. Joseph Smith commented,
Great excitement now prevailed, and mobs were heard of in every direction, who seemed determined on our destruction. They burned the houses in the country and took off all the cattle they could find. They destroyed cornfields, took many prisoners, and threatened death to all Mormons.
As a result of these difficulties, the Brethren sent word to all of the smaller Mormon communities directing those saints to gather either to Far West or Adam-on-Diamond for their own protection. This directive was readily heeded by some, but others unwisely chose not to obey. Brother John L. Butler elected to follow the counsel of the prophet Joseph and saved himself and his family from serious injury or possibly death. In recalling the circumstances, he said,
I concluded to ride over to Far West, some 14 miles from where we lived, and I saw Brother Joseph Smith. He resided there. He asked me if I had removed my family. I told him no, I had not. Then, says he, go and move them directly, and do not sleep another night there. But, said I don't like to be a coward. Go and do as I tell you, said he. So I started back again and got home about 2 hours after dark. I then said to my wife, we must pack up our things and leave here directly, for Brother Joseph has told me to. My wife was very glad, for she had been wanting to move for a long time. So we loaded up one wagon load and took it down to Brother Taylor's, about 1.5 miles, and my wife and Melinda Porter, a young woman that was boarding with us, who was keeping school, they packed up another wagon load by the time I got back, and we all got started just about break of day. Now about sunrise, or a little while after, Brother G saw at the distance a large body of men. He said that he thought that there were about 30-odd. He watched them come towards the house and surround it. He then ran down to Taylor to tell them that we were all killed, I suppose. And when he saw us, he said, Oh, I am so glad that you are here, for there are about 30 men around your house to kill you all. I then saw the hand of the Lord in guiding Brother Joseph Smith to direct me to move my family away. If he had not, why, in all probability, we should have been murdered. And I felt to thank God with all my heart and soul. I then started on to Far West.
Unlike John L. Butler, Jacob Haun was unwilling to leave his property, which decision led to tragic consequences. As early as 1835, Brother Haun had established a mill on Shoal Creek. This area was later to be included in Caldwell County. By October 1838, the little community of Haun's Mill boasted a blacksmith shop, 6 houses, and a population of about 50 persons. This figure was swelled to over 100 with the arrival of some immigrants just prior to the massacre. The latter group was living in their wagons and tents. Jacob called on the prophet to consult with him on the policy of moving to fortified camps. He was cautioned to
move in by all means if you wish to save your lives. You had much better lose your property than your lives. One can be replaced. The other cannot be restored. But there is no need of your losing either if you will only do as you are commanded.
Still concerned with the possible loss of property and buildings to mob action, Haun decided to remain at the mill. He informed the saints that the prophet had counseled them to stay and defend their homes if they thought they could, otherwise they were to go to Far West. Believing that Joseph desired them to maintain the mill site, they concluded to stay. The saints felt partially secure as they had entered into a mutual peace agreement with one of the non-Mormon captains, Nehemiah Comstock. Promises were made that neither side would molest the other. However, this insecure truce was broken by the Gentile militia on October 30th, 1838. On the afternoon of that day, a company of mobbers, some 200 in number, moved on Haun's Mill. They were under the command of Colonel Thomas Jennings and Captain Nehemiah Comstock. As they neared the settlement, the militia dismounted, marched across the open prairie to the woods just north of the mill, and filtered through the trees. Elder David Evans, captain of the Mormon defense, ran toward them, waving his hat and calling, "Peace! Peace!" However, his plea was not heard. About 100 rifles were discharged by the mob, who aimed at the blacksmith shop where a number of brethren had fled for safety. On their approach, the leader of the mob had called,
"All who desire to save their lives and make peace, run into the blacksmith shop."
This was done treacherously, however, as narrated in the following account.
The infuriated assailants immediately surrounded the shop and commenced firing between the logs, the cracks between which were sufficiently large to enable them to aim directly at the brethren who had fled there for refuge, there being no chinking between the logs. They also fired through a long opening made at one side of the shop by one of the logs being sawed out to admit light. And at the same time they fired through the door, which was standing open. The mob continued firing until they thought all inside had been killed or mortally wounded. They then entered, and among the dead and dying, they found Suddius Smith, a lad 10 years old, who in his fear had crawled under the bellows for safety. He was dragged from his place of concealment by William Reynolds, a Livingston County man, who placed the muzzle of his gun near the boy's head and literally shot off the upper part of it. The 7-year-old brother of the murdered boy, Alma L., was shot through the hip. He had seen his father and brother shot down, and fearing, if he moved, that the heartless wretches would shoot him again, he remained quiet among the dead until he heard the voice of his mother quietly calling his name in the darkness.
Thomas McBride, an old gentleman, surrendered his weapon and asked that his life be spared, but he was shot down with his own gun. A Mr. Rogers of Davies County next attacked the fallen man with a corn cutter, leaving him covered with a score of unsightly wounds. Men, women, and children ran in every direction, terrified by the bloodthirsty attack. Sister Amanda Smith grabbed her 2 little girls and ran across the mill dam. Volley after volley was fired by the mob in an attempt to kill them as they climbed the hill on the opposite side of the stream. She escaped with only bullet holes in her clothing, however. Mary Steadwell, a young lady, was shot through the hand just as she reached a fallen tree. Fainting from the wound, Mary fell behind the tree. Upwards of 20 shots were fired into that protective shield as she lay there unconscious. Brother Nathan K. Knight saw the mob approaching and caught up his gun to aid in the defense. He shot one man who was in the act of attacking Thomas McBride and then was hit himself. His ordeal has been recorded in these words.
A few moments later, Elder Knight was wounded in one of the fingers of his right hand. Next, he was hit by a ball in his left leg and subsequently by a third ball in his body, the latter entering just above the small of his back and lodging below the pit of his stomach. This last shot brought him to his hands and knees. By exerting himself to the utmost, he succeeded in getting 3/4 of a mile away through the timber and brush, and secreted himself in some fallen treetops. There he remained about an hour, and a little after sunset, he saw Sister Polly Wood at a distance. He motioned for her to come to him, as he by this time had become so weak with bleeding from his wounds that he could neither speak nor rise to his feet. The young lady came and tried to lead him back to the village, but he was too weak to walk. She then kneeled by his side, placed her hands on his wounds, and prayed that God would strengthen and heal him. Elder Knight said afterwards, "I never heard a more powerful prayer. The Lord answered her petition, and I received sufficient strength to walk back to Haun's house by resting 3 or 4 times.
Some 40 to 50 women and children gathered together and ran about 3 miles into the woods where they hid themselves. There, according to Sister Margaret Fouts,
we huddled together, spreading what few blankets or shawls we chanced to have on the ground for the children. And there we remained until 2 o'clock the next morning, before we heard anything of the result of the firing at the mill.
Lamenting this awful condition, Sister Fouts continued,
Who can imagine our feelings during this dreadful suspense? And when the news did come, oh, what terrible news! Fathers, brothers, and sons inhumanly butchered.
The mob remained to pillage the settlement after having killed or dispersed any who could offer resistance. When they left, they took with them property of every description, including horses, wagons, and cows. The living were left without the necessities of life.
It was a terrible night indeed for the survivors of the awful tragedy. The groans and shrieks of the wounded made the night hideous and horrible beyond description. The women were sobbing in their great anguish of spirit. The children were crying loudly with fear and grief.
In all, 17 men and boys were killed during the massacre or died of their wounds in succeeding days. 9-year-old Charles Merrick suffered for 5 weeks before dying. Jacob Haun was among the wounded, but was nursed back to health. 3 Missourians wounded in the fighting were taken out in wagons stolen from the Mormons. The following day, the saints placed their dead brethren in a hole which had been dug for a well. a little northwest of the mill. No one knew when the attackers would return, and with so many dead and wounded, it was difficult to give them a proper burial. Although severely wounded, Alma L. Smith was spared from death by the direct assistance of the Lord. Amanda Smith, Alma's mother, described the miraculous aid which was received. Sister Smith recorded,
"The entire hip joint of my wounded boy had been shot away. Flesh, hip bone, joint and all had been plowed out from the muzzle of the gun, which the ruffian placed to the child's hip through the logs of the shop and deliberately fired. We laid little Alma on a bed in our tent, and I examined the wound. It was a ghastly sight. I knew not what to do. It was night now. 'Oh, my Heavenly Father,' I cried, 'what shall I do? Thou seest my poor wounded boy and knowest my inexperience. Oh, Heavenly Father, direct me what to do.' And then I was directed as by a voice speaking to me.
Amanda was instructed to make a lye from ashes and cleanse the wound. Next, she was directed,
As distinctly as though a physician had been standing by speaking,
to her to prepare a slippery elm poultice and fill the wound with it. The contents of a bottle of balsam were similarly poured into the wound the following day. The results of this unusual medication were astounding. As she applied the balsam, Sister Smith said,
'Alma, my child, you believe the Lord made your hip?' 'Yes, Mother.' 'Well, the Lord can make something there in place of your hip. Don't you believe he can, Alma?' 'Do you think that the Lord can, Mother?' inquired the child in his simplicity. 'Yes, my son,' I replied. 'He has shown it all to me in a vision.' Then I laid him comfortable on his face and said, 'Now you lay like that and don't move, and the Lord will make you another hip.' So Alma laid on his face for 5 weeks, until he was entirely recovered, a flexible gristle having grown in place of the missing joint and socket, which remains to this day a marvel to physicians. On the day that he walked again, I was out of the house fetching a bucket of water, when I heard screams from the children. Running back in a fright, I entered, and there was Alma on the floor, dancing around, and the children screaming in astonishment and joy. It is now nearly 40 years ago, but Alma has never been the least crippled during his life, and he has traveled quite a long period of the time as a missionary of the gospel, and a living miracle of the power of God.
Many of the inhabitants of Haun's Mill were among the first Mormons to be compelled to leave the state of Missouri. Captain Comstock issued personal orders requiring their departure. David Lewis was given the choice of renouncing Mormonism or getting out. He chose to leave rather than deny that Joseph Smith was a prophet. Despite a series of appeals, none of the men who had attacked the settlement of Haun's Mill were ever tried before a civil court for their participation in the murder of men and boys who were peaceful citizens in pursuit of a livelihood and their religious beliefs. Whether Colonel Thomas Jennings was acting on his own or upon the governor's extermination order, the massacre helped to achieve the desired results: Mormon expulsion from the state of Missouri. Responsibility for carrying out Governor Lilburn W. Boggs' order of extermination was placed in the hands of General John B. Clark, commander of the 1st Division of the Missouri State Militia. However, other generals actually ended the Mormon War before Clark could arrive on the scene. General Samuel D. Lucas and David W. Atchison laid plans for an immediate march on Far West. On October 29, 1838, they moved their forces to a point 16 miles south of the Mormon stronghold. The following day, these troops were joined by General Alexander W. Doniphan, who had already been operating in the area. On the outskirts of Far West, Doniphan's troops nearly cut off 150 Mormon horsemen who had been patrolling the area south of the community. A member of Doniphan's command has given us a description of the lively action which followed.
"We saw the Mormons under full run, aiming to beat us to town. Colonel Doniphan ordered us to charge and try to cut them off from town. We all filed in after our leader, down the hill, across Goose Creek in full speed. The Mormons beat us and had formed their line between us and town. We climbed the hill, formed our line right in front and not more than 100 yards from them, awaiting orders and expecting every moment to see the smoke and hear the report of their guns."
The Mormons didn't choose to fire on the militia, however, as they wanted a peaceful settlement of the difficulties if possible. Nevertheless, the prophet recognized the probability of a major battle and assembled the brethren on the public square at Far West. According to Ebenezer Robinson, Joseph
endeavored to inspire the hearts of his hearers with courage and deeds of valor in defense of our families, our homes, and our firesides.
When the brethren observed the heavy concentration of militia moving against Far West, Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball were appointed captains of 50 and commanded to take up positions on the direct route of the enemy into town. Heber C. Kimball recalled this dangerous situation when he reported,
"The army came up to within good rifle shot and halted, seeing our temporary fortifications which we had thrown up the night previous by pulling down some of our houses and fixing up our wagons. They dared not approach nearer, but retreated to Goose Creek, about 3/4 of a mile, screaming, hallooing, and screeching. The devils in hell could not have made a more hideous howling. The mob declared there were 1,500 of us, but to my certain knowledge, there were only about 150 in that line."
The following day, Colonel George M. Hinkle, commander of the Mormon militia, attempted to negotiate with General Lucas. General Lucas provided him with a copy of Governor Boggs' order of extermination and delivered his own terms for a settlement of the war. Colonel Hinkle had been instructed by the prophet to confer with him before accepting any proposals. Hinkle did not carry out these instructions. He made a separate agreement with General Lucas and merely informed Joseph that Samuel D. Lucas wanted to meet in a negotiating session with himself and other leaders. Those named were Joseph Smith, Lyman White, Sidney Rigdon, Parley P. Pratt, and George W. Robinson. Joseph talked to the brethren and then agreed to meet General Lucas. As the opposing parties met between the two lines, Colonel Hinkle suddenly exclaimed,
"Here, General, are the prisoners I agreed to deliver to you."
General Lucas, who was mounted, immediately raised his sword and called,
"You are my prisoners, and there is no time for talking at the present. You will march into the camp."
Parley P. Pratt has given us a vivid description of the scene that followed Lucas' command.
"We were marched into camp surrounded by thousands of savage-looking beings, many of whom were dressed and painted like Indian warriors. These all set up a constant yell, like so many bloodhounds let loose upon their prey, as if they had achieved one of the most miraculous victories that ever graced the annals of the world. In camp, we were placed under a strong guard and were without shelter during the night, lying on the ground in the open air in the midst of a great rain. The guards during the whole night kept up a constant tirade of mockery and the most obscene blackguardism and abuse. They blasphemed God, mocked Jesus Christ, swore the most dreadful oaths, taunted Brother Joseph and others, demanded miracles, wanted signs, such as, "Come, Mr. Smith, show us an angel. Give us one of your revelations. Show us a miracle."
While the brethren were being mocked by their guards, General Lucas conducted a court-martial of the prisoners without their being allowed to be present. After a brief examination of their case, the court ordered that the captives be shot for their treasonous acts. General Lucas then issued this order.
Brigadier General Donovan, sir, you will take Joseph Smith and the other prisoners into the public square of Far West and shoot them at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Samuel D. Lucas.
Alexander Donovan openly refused to obey the order. In a written reply to his superior, Donovan declared,
"It is cold-blooded murder. I will not obey your order. My brigade shall march for liberty tomorrow at 8 o'clock, and if you execute these men, I will hold you responsible before an earthly tribunal, so help me God. A.W. Donovan, Brigadier General."
Donovan's prompt actions saved the brethren from probable execution the following day. He was never called to account for his failure to obey a direct order, although General Lucas did try to get Governor Boggs to remove Donovan's military commission for his act of disobedience. When Alexander W. Donovan visited Salt Lake City in 1874, he was greeted by the saints with much warmth. George A. Smith said of him on that occasion,
"There are few men whose names have been identified with the history of our church with more pleasant feelings to its members than General Donovan."
The next day, November 1st, 1838, General Lucas ordered his troops to march to Far West for the formal surrender. His force formed a hollow square on the southeast side of the city. Colonel Hinkle marched the Far West militia into this square and directed them to ground their arms. He then rode forward and delivered up his sword and pistols to General Lucas. Heber C. Kimball said that as soon as the Mormon defenders laid down their weapons at Far West,
the mob then commenced plundering the citizens of their bedding, clothing, money, wearing apparel, and everything of value they could lay their hands upon.
A Mormon who had apostatized from the church, William E. McClellan, came to where Heber was and chided him, saying,
"Brother Heber, what do you think of the fallen prophet now? Has he not led you blindfolded long enough? Look and see yourself, poor, your family's stripped and robbed, and your brother in the same fix. Are you satisfied with Joseph?"
Elder Kimball promptly replied,
"Yes, I am more satisfied with him 100-fold than ever I was before. For I see you in the very position that he foretold you would be in, a Judas to betray your brethren. If you did not forsake your lying and abominations, where are you? What are you about? You and Hinkle, and scores of others. Have you not betrayed Joseph and his brethren into the hands of the mob, as Judas did Jesus? Yes, verily you have. I tell you, Mormonism is true, and Joseph is a true prophet of the living God.
Joseph Smith and his fellow prisoners were marched from General Lucas' camp to the square at Far West. There the brethren were to be placed in a wagon and taken to Independence. Before leaving, they successfully pleaded with their captors to allow them a moment to say goodbye to their families. Joseph recorded this heart-rending separation.
I found my wife and children in tears, who feared we had been shot by those who had sworn to take our lives, and that they would see me no more. When I entered my house, they clung to my garments, their eyes streaming with tears, while mingled emotions of joy and sorrow were manifested in their countenances. I requested to have a private interview with them a few minutes, but this privilege was denied me by the guard. I was then obliged to take my departure. Who can realize the feelings which I experienced at that time, to be thus torn from my companion, and leave her surrounded with monsters in the shape of men, and my children too, not knowing how their wants would be supplied, while I was to be taken far from them, in order that my enemies might destroy me when they thought proper to do so. My partner wept, my children clung to me until they were thrust from me by the swords of the guards. I felt overwhelmed while I witnessed the scene, and could only recommend them to the care of that God whose kindness had followed me to the present time, and who alone could protect them, and deliver me from the hands of my enemies, and restore me to my family.
The pain of separation from loved ones was again experienced by the prophet and Hiram as they, along with other prisoners, were placed in a wagon which was covered with canvas and the sides nailed down. General Moses Wilson and his brigade surrounded the vehicle in readiness for the march to Jackson County. Just as they were about to depart, Joseph's mother and his sister Lucy were escorted through the throng to the wagon. Mother Smith described that tearful moment with her sons.
The man who led us through the crowd spoke to Hiram, who was sitting in front, and, telling him that his mother had come to see him, requested that he should reach his hand to me. He did so, but I was not allowed to see him. The cover was of strong cloth and nailed down so close that he could barely get his hand through. We had merely shaken hands with him when we were ordered away by the mob, who forbade any conversation between us. And threatening to shoot us, they ordered the teamster to drive over us. Our friend then conducted us to the back part of the wagon, where Joseph sat, and said, "Mr. Smith, your mother and sister are here, and wish to shake hands with you." Joseph crowded his hand through between the cover and wagon, and we caught hold of it. But he spoke not to either of us until I said, "Joseph, do speak to your poor mother once more. I cannot bear to go till I hear your voice." "God bless you, Mother," he sobbed out. Then a cry was raised, and the wagon dashed off, tearing him from us, just as Lucy pressed his hand to her lips to bestow upon it a sister's last kiss, for he was then sentenced to be shot.
After camping for the night on Crooked River, the captives and their guards arose the next morning and made preparations to continue the ride to Independence. As they did so, Joseph spoke to the other prisoners in a cheerful and confidential tone.
Be of good cheer, brethren. The word of the Lord came to me last night, that our lives should be given us, and that whatever we may suffer during this captivity, not one of our lives should be taken.
The prisoners were triumphantly exhibited to the people all along the road to Independence. As they entered Jackson County, some ladies and gentlemen visited the camp to see these strange followers. One of the women inquired of the troops which prisoner was the Lord whom the Mormons worshipped. A guard pointed out the prophet. Joseph narrated the conversation which followed, saying,
The woman then turning to me inquired whether I professed to be the Lord and Savior. I replied that I professed to be nothing but a man, and a minister of salvation sent by Jesus Christ to preach the gospel. This answer so surprised the woman that she began to inquire into our doctrine, and I preached a discourse both to her and her companions, and to the wondering soldiers who listened with almost breathless attention while I set forth the doctrine of faith in Jesus Christ, and repentance, and baptism for remission of sins, with the promise of the Holy Ghost, as recorded in the 2nd chapter of the Acts of the Apostles. The woman was satisfied, and praised God in the hearing of the soldiers, and went away praying that God would protect and deliver us.
At Independence, a large crowd assembled to have a look at the prisoners. Joseph and his brethren were placed in a vacant house where they were required to sleep on the floor. They were later moved to the Knowlton Hotel and treated more kindly. Numbers of people flocked to see them, and their time was spent in preaching and conversation. The brethren were even allowed to visit the temple lot and walk the streets of Independence. However, their stay in that community was shortened by the arrival of Colonel Sterling Price, with orders from General Clark to General Lucas, directing that the captives be brought to Richmond in Ray County. Parley P. Pratt recorded the circumstances of the transfer.
Generals Lucas and Wilson had tried in vain to get a guard to accompany us. None would volunteer, and when drafted, they would not obey orders, for in truth, they wished us to go at liberty. At last, a colonel and 2 or 3 officers started with us, with their swords and pistols, which was more to protect us than keeping us from escaping. On this journey, some of us rode in carriages and some on horseback. Sometimes we were 60 or 80 rods in front or rear of our guard, who, by the by, were 3 sheets in the wind, in the whiskey line, having a bottle in their pockets. But knowing that we were not guilty of any crime, we did not wish to escape by flight. At night, having crossed the ferry, we put up at a private house. Here our guards all went to bed and to sleep, leaving us their pistols to defend ourselves in case of any attack from without, as we were in a very hostile neighborhood.
In Richmond, the brethren were again imprisoned in an old vacant house, but this time their treatment was far from cordial. Joseph stated,
Colonel Price came in with 2 chains in his hands and a number of padlocks. The 2 chains he fastened together. He had with him 10 men, armed, who stood at the time of these operations with a thumb on the cock of their guns. They first nailed down the windows, then came and ordered a man by the name of John Fulkerson, whom he had with him, to chain us together with chains and padlocks, being 7 in number. After that he searched us, examining our pockets to see if we had any arms. He found nothing but pocket knives, but these he took away with him.
Colonel Price allowed the guards to torment and abuse the prisoners unmercifully. Foul-mouthed and vulgar, these base men kept up a torrent of oaths and obscene jests directed at their Mormon captives. One night, when this filthy language was at its height, and the guards were recounting deeds of murder and robbery committed against the saints, Parley P. Pratt could scarcely contain himself. He lay next to the prophet and knew that he was awake and as troubled as himself. Suddenly Joseph was on his feet, and in a voice of thunder exclaimed,
Silence, ye fiends of the infernal pit! In the name of Jesus Christ I rebuke you, and command you to be still. I will not live another minute and hear such language. Cease such talk, or you or I die this instant.
Elder Pratt expressed the singular effect of that moment on all the hearers.
He, Joseph, ceased to speak. He stood erect in terrible majesty, chained and without a weapon, calm, unruffled, and dignified as an angel. He looked upon the quailing guards, whose weapons were lowered or dropped to the ground, whose knees smote together, and who, shrinking into a corner or crouching at his feet, begged his pardon, and remained quiet till a change of guards. I have seen ministers of justice clothed in magisterial robes, and criminals arraigned before them, while life was suspended on a breath in the courts of England. I have witnessed a Congress in solemn session to give laws to nations. I have tried to conceive of kings, of royal courts, of thrones and crowns, and of emperors assembled to decide the fate of kingdoms. But dignity and majesty have I seen but once, as it stood in chains at midnight in a dungeon in an obscure village of Missouri.